It is funny how a single word can offer this completely new lens through which to view your day-to-day life. Take the Afrikaners word for human, which is mens. On the surface, I mean, it's just a simple everyday noun.
Right, just a basic label.
Exactly. But if you trace the historical and linguistic resonance of that word back to the German philosophical tradition of the Mensch, suddenly you aren't just talking about a biological entity walking down the street. You're opening this massive, centuries-old can of worms about what it actually requires to be a genuinely good human being.
It really is the ultimate philosophical puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's a puzzle that, it just doesn't respect geographical borders or time periods. Whether you're analyzing ancient scrolls or observing modern behavioral psychology, every civilization has attempted to establish a baseline for human goodness.
Yeah, and then immediately run into problems.
Oh, absolutely. They've all struggled with the mechanics of scaling that individual goodness up, trying to build a society that doesn't inevitably collapse under its own weight.
And that struggle is the exact territory we're exploring today. We have a deeply rich piece of source material for this deep dive. It's a sweeping philosophical essay by Ferry de Bruyns titled The Universal Quest for the Virtuous Human.
It's a fantastic piece of synthesis, really.
It really is. De Bruyns takes this linguistic thread and weaves it into a global expedition. So our mission today, for you listening, is to follow that thread. We're going to examine the dense, complicated forests of German philosophy, travel to the imperial courts of ancient China, cross the harsh deserts of early Arabia, and surprisingly, trace all of this back to a quiet, modern-day suburb in South Africa.
It's quite the itinerary.
Yeah, buckle up. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the Western baseline. That means confronting Martin Heidegger and Friedrich Nietzsche. When we look at Heidegger, I find it fascinating how much effort he spent just tearing down the old definitions before he even offered his own.
To really appreciate Heidegger's contribution, you have to look at the rigid framework he was dismantling. I mean, for centuries, the classical Western definition of a human came from Aristotle, who categorized us simply as the rational animal. It's a highly clinical, almost mathematical way of looking at existence.
Right, like checking boxes on a clipboard.
Exactly. You take a biological animal, you add a prefrontal cortex capable of logic, and boom, you have a human. But Heidegger felt this was just a catastrophic oversimplification. He argued that defining us merely as rational animals completely ignores the emotional and, well, the existential weight of our reality.
Which he termed our being in the world, right?
Yes. He coined the concept of Dasein, which roughly translates to being there.
So instead of viewing a human as a fixed object on a table that you can just measure and dissect, Dasein suggests we are defined by the constant, thrumming anxiety of our own potential.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, we're the only creatures that lay awake at night stressing about who we are going to become in 10 years. Our existence is an active issue for us.
Right, that underlying anxiety of choice, that's the engine of Dasein. We are beings of pure, terrifying possibility. And in his later writings, Heidegger actually pushes this even further. He rejects the industrial era view of the human as the grand master and conqueror of nature.
Yeah, the whole dominating the earth narrative.
Exactly. Instead, he describes the Mensch as the shepherd of being. We aren't supposed to be extracting and dominating. We're meant to be quiet, observant stewards of truth, carefully tending to the reality unfolding around us.
I really love that imagery, the shepherd of being. But then we cross the philosophical street to Friedrich Nietzsche, and that quiet, pastoral imagery just vanishes entirely.
Oh, completely. It's a hard pivot.
Whenever Nietzsche's term for the ultimate human, the Übermensch, is brought up, my mind immediately goes to the darkest chapters of 20th century history. It just carries this heavy, heavy baggage of eugenics and domination.
What's fascinating here is just how completely that concept was hijacked, and really inverted, by political movements long after Nietzsche's death. The Übermensch was tragically weaponized to justify biological massacre races and military tyranny, but reading Nietzsche's actual texts reveals an intensely private, almost agonizing personal ideal.
So it isn't about stepping on other people at all.
Not even a little bit. It has absolutely zero to do with ruling over a weaker neighbor or conquering a nation. It is a philosophy of radical self-overcoming. You see, Nietzsche was diagnosing a world where, as he famously proclaimed, God is dead.
The overarching religious frameworks were collapsing.
Exactly. The cultural frameworks that previously handed people their morals on a silver platter were just gone. In that terrifying vacuum, the Übermensch is the rare individual who refuses to slide into nihilism. They refuse to blindly adopt the comfortable default settings of what he called herd morality.
So, the Übermensch isn't about conquering others. It's more like a radical personal software update where you stop relying on herd morality default settings and write your own code. It sounds less like a political conquest and much more like, I don't know, being thrown into the middle of the ocean in the dead of night.
That's a very visceral way to put it.
Well, if the North Star is gone, if those traditional frameworks are dead, you can't just float there waiting to drown. The Übermensch is the person who figures out how to build their own compass out of driftwood and sheer willpower. They have to invent their own moral true north.
Building a compass in the dark is a brilliant analogy. And a crucial mechanism of building that compass is a concept Nietzsche called amor fati, the love of fate. The Übermensch doesn't just tolerate reality, they vigorously affirm it. They say a radical yes to all of existence.
Even the terrible parts.
Especially the terrible parts. That doesn't just mean enjoying the beautiful sunsets. It means loving the agonizing heartbreaks, the chronic illnesses, the daily frustrations. It's about seeing every single piece of suffering as a necessary, beautiful thread in the tapestry of their self-creation.
Wow. That is an incredibly heavy lift for one person.
It is. They do not invent imaginary afterlives to escape to. They master the chaos within themselves. Nietzsche viewed the Mensch, the ordinary human, as merely a fragile rope tied between the beast and the Übermensch, a terrifying bridge over an abyss, constantly striving for a self-mastery they might never fully reach.
But if I try to apply this to the real world, a massive structural problem immediately surfaces. I mean, if we have a society of 8 billion people, and every single one of them is an isolated individual frantically trying to build their own unique moral compass in the dark, that sounds like a recipe for absolute social exhaustion.
Oh, it would be pure chaos.
Right. If everyone is radically overcoming themselves and writing their own independent moral code, you have 8 billion different true norths. They are going to constantly crash into each other. You cannot build a functioning cooperative society on a foundation of pure individual rebellion.
No, you can't.
You have to find a framework that prioritizes the friction between people rather than just the friction within the individual.
And that structural limitation is precisely what forces us to look beyond the Western paradigm. When we pivot to ancient China and the philosophy of Confucius, the focus shifts entirely. It moves away from the radical, isolated individual to the delicate, interlocking harmony of the collective.
He wasn't exactly writing for the lone rebel.
Not at all. Confucius wasn't interested in lone figures staring into the abyss. He was interested in how the person treats their parents, their neighbors, and their magistrates. And to build that social harmony, he categorized human behavior into a highly specific binary. You have the jūnzǐ versus the singren.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because De Bruijn dedicates a significant portion of his essay to the translation of those two specific terms. The older English translations we used to see in textbooks did a massive disservice to what Confucius was actually trying to build.
They really did. It completely warped the perception of his work in the West.
They used to translate jūnzǐ as the superior man and singren as the mean man.
Those Victorian-era translations completely distorted the underlying mechanics of Confucian thought. Calling someone a superior man implies a rigid, arrogant caste system. It suggests a person is simply born into a higher echelon of humanity and looks down on everyone else.
And mean man sounds like a comic book villain.
Right. It implies active, cartoonish cruelty, like someone who goes out of their way to cause harm. Modern linguistic scholars, particularly thinkers like Roger Ames, have corrected this. The most accurate translation for gens is the exemplary person.
Which fundamentally changes the mechanism.
Completely. You are not born exemplary. You achieve it through a grueling, lifelong process of self-cultivation. An exemplary person is defined by profound humility and a commitment to righteousness.
And on the other side of that coin, the singren is now translated as the petty person. It isn't about being actively malicious or evil. It's about being morally immature.
Yes, immature is the perfect word.
The petty person is the individual who is obsessed with short-term profit, who gossips, who acts entirely out of self-interest. Their vision extends no further than their own ego.
The petty person is small-minded. So the entire Confucian project is simply trying to transition as many people as possible from petty, self-interested behavior into exemplary, community-minded behavior.
But if anyone can become a jūnzǐ through self-cultivation, what was Confucius actually trying to achieve on a macro level? Because I keep thinking about the sheer scale of the environment he was operating in. He wasn't just holding neighborhood seminars.
No, he was playing a much larger game.
He was living during the Zhou dynasty, which was this sprawling, ancient, highly literate civilization that was slowly falling apart at the seams. The bureaucracy was corrupt, the regional lords were warring, and the social fabric was tearing. So his macro strategy seems to have been entirely focused on internal renovation.
The environment dictated the strategy.
Yeah.
Because the Zhou dynasty already existed as a massive civil container, his problem wasn't building a society from scratch. His problem was a crumbling establishment. His logic for fixing it was an inside-out approach.
Fix the people to fix the state.
Exactly. He believed that if you relentlessly cultivate the virtue of the individual person, that virtue naturally stabilizes the family home. And if you have enough stabilized virtuous homes, they will eventually produce virtuous leaders who will gradually ascend into the existing government and cure the institutional rot.
It is the ultimate reformative strategy. But I mean, that entire strategy relies on a massive assumption. It assumes that you actually have a heist to renovate.
Right, you need a pre-existing structure.
Reforming an establishment from the inside out makes perfect sense when you have courts and laws and established borders. But what if you are born into a world where there is no stable civil container at all? If the society around you is built purely on tribal warfare, blood feuds, and violent oppression, you can't just gently teach humility and wait for it to trickle up into a government that doesn't exist.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that profound contextual friction is exactly what defines the emergence of the Quranic tradition and the role of the prophets in the Middle East. De Bruyne notes that the Quran offers a behavioral binary that structurally mirrors the Confucian system.
It's really striking how similar the frameworks are on the surface.
It is. You have the Tayyib and the Khabeeth. Functionally, in a social setting, they operate much like the exemplary person and the petty person. The Tayyib is the pure, wholesome individual who naturally elevates and nourishes their community. The Khabeeth is the corrupt, vile individual who pollutes their surroundings.
Right.
The text actually highlights a verse from Surah An-Nur demonstrating this natural magnetism. It essentially says that good is inevitably drawn to good, and corrupt is drawn to corrupt.
The behavioral outcomes might look similar, but the actual engine driving those behaviors is completely different. I mean, Confucius built his system on a fundamentally humanistic foundation. The authority comes from human tradition, ancestral respect, and the desire for earthly social harmony.
Yes, the focus was very grounded in the human realm.
But the Quranic system is strictly theocentric. The ultimate authority doesn't come from ancestral tradition, it comes directly from divine revelation.
And that metaphysical difference changes how the two systems diagnose the problem of bad behavior. In the Confucian model, the petty person is viewed mostly as foolish or uneducated. They are highly redeemable if they just commit to studying and practicing rituals.
So it's a matter of ignorance, not evil.
Exactly. But in the Quranic framework, the Khabeeth implies a much more severe condition. It is an intrinsic spiritual malignancy, an active rottenness of the soul. Better education won't cure it. It requires divine grace and an agonizing process of spiritual repentance.
Which brings us back to the stark difference in their historical contexts. Confucius was an insider trying to reform a decaying empire. Prophets like Muhammad or Moses were absolute outsiders operating in fractured tribal environments where the existing power structures were inherently tyrannical and idolatrous.
They had no civil container to work with.
Right, so their mission was not reform, it was demolition and foundation. To use an analogy for you listening, it's the difference between hiring Confucius as an interior decorator to fix up an old, decaying mansion versus bringing in the prophets as architects to build a brand new house in the middle of the wilderness.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. Confucius is stripping the old wallpaper and fixing the floorboards to bring the house back to its former glory. The prophets were architects dropped into a hostile wilderness surrounded by wolves. They couldn't remodel what was there.
They had to pour a completely new foundation.
Yes, they had to build a brand new house from the ground up, often while actively defending themselves. The prophets were tasked with forging an entirely new civilizational reality, an Ummah, built purely on the absolute, uncompromising divinity of the message.
But building an entire nation from scratch on pure spiritual foundations sounds practically impossible to sustain over multiple generations. If the prophets were building a new house based on profound inner purity, how did the actual historical empires that followed them turn out?
Not great. History brutally confirms that sustaining that purity is incredibly difficult.
I have to imagine that once those original prophets passed away, human greed and the intoxicating lure of power crept right back in, and those holy foundations just morphed into standard political machines.
De Bruyne is very sharp in his critique here. The centuries following the foundational era of the prophets saw the explosion of vast Islamic empires. But these empires largely abandoned the intimate foundational purity of the Tayyib. Instead, they became obsessed with external machinery.
They focused on the state, not the soul.
Exactly. The Umayyads leaned heavily into Arab tribal supremacy to maintain control. The Abbasids essentially swallowed the old Persian imperial bureaucracy whole. The Ottomans absorbed the Byzantine military and administrative structures, and the Safavids fused with ancient Persian kingship models.
So they successfully built the external walls of the house. They had massive armies, unprecedented wealth, and breathtaking architecture. But they completely neglected the microethics, the internal spiritual condition of the people living inside those walls.
And De Bruyne uses the sheer granularity of the Arabic language to expose this failure. He zeroes in on the limitations of imperial law. An empire can create highly specific legal categories for bad actors. If someone is a mujrim, a criminal who commits a physical act of theft, the imperial courts can punish them.
Because it's an observable action.
Right. If someone is a fasik, openly rebelling against the state, the army can crush them. If they are a fasid, an active corrupter, the magistrates can deal with them. But imperial machinery is entirely powerless against a munafiq, a hypocrite.
The hypocrite flies under the radar.
Exactly. A hypocrite might follow every single law perfectly in public, but harbor a Khabeeth heart. That inner rottenness secretly sows division, spreads malicious rumors, and destroys community trust from the shadows. You cannot legislate away inner corruption.
Because these massive empires focused almost exclusively on external compliance, the inner rottenness thrived. And that leads to profound stagnation and eventual collapse. But wait, didn't anyone try to fix this inner rottenness when the empires became tyrannical?
Yes, absolutely. Historically, that burden fell to the Sufis, the mystics of the Islamic world. They recognized that a perfectly executed legal code couldn't make a person Tayyib. The reform had to occur in the unseen territory of the human heart.
So how did they tackle it?
To achieve this, they began importing complex philosophical tools. They look west, absorbing elements of Neoplatonism and Gnosticism from the remnants of Greece and Rome. They look south, pulling deeply from Indian concepts of meditation, breath control, and the unity of existence via Confucian trade routes.
But it is glaringly obvious who they didn't borrow from. They completely ignored China. They ignored Confucius, the one philosopher who had literally engineered the ultimate practical operating system for everyday, microethical social harmony. Why didn't those two worlds ever synthesize?
The barriers were simply too immense. Beyond the staggering geographical and linguistic isolation separating the Middle East and ancient China, the theological friction was just insurmountable. The Sufis were fundamentally grounded in the pursuit of a highly personal, intimate creator God.
And Confucius didn't have that framework at all.
No, he didn't. Confucius did not speak of a personal deity. He spoke of Tian, or heaven, which he viewed as an impersonal, natural moral order of the cosmos. Furthermore, the Confucian texts were intricately woven into ancient Chinese ancestral rituals.
Which would be a huge red flag for a medieval monotheist.
A massive red flag. To an Orthodox medieval scholar, those rituals wouldn't just look alien, they would likely be perceived as dangerous idolatry. The ideological chasm was simply too wide to cross.
So what does this all mean? We have the Western ideal of mastering individual chaos. We have the Eastern methodology for building meticulous social harmony. We have the Middle Eastern mandate for profound divine purity.
All operating in isolation.
Right. For thousands of years, these brilliant systems remained trapped in their historical silos. The empires rose and fell because they could never quite figure out how to weave the inner spiritual purity together with the outer civic harmony. Where do these disparate threads, the grand message of the prophets and the practical method of Confucius, finally actually intertwine?
This is where De Bruyne executes a breathtaking thematic pivot. The culmination of this sweeping historical narrative doesn't take place in a pristine academic hall or a resurrected imperial palace. It manifests in the author's own lived reality.
A modern, quiet suburb in South Africa.
Yes, a working-class neighborhood. The way he describes this space is incredibly vivid. It is a completely mixed space. Christians and Muslims are living right next door to each other, sharing walls and streets.
And there are no militarized police forcing them to get along.
None at all. The streets are clean, there is no graffiti, and the local gangs have no foothold. And most importantly, this environment isn't maintained by the government. It's maintained by parents, privately teaching their children the mechanics of fundamental respect.
It is the living, breathing synthesis of everything we've discussed today. De Bruijn observes that you can drive to neighboring areas where there is incredibly loud, performative religiosity, massive billboards, and shouting preachers.
But all that noise doesn't mean anything.
Exactly. That outward display doesn't guarantee you will find a Tayyib individual or an exemplary person. True, enduring civilization is not built on loud proclamations or massive state apparatuses. It is built on the quiet, often invisible micro-behaviors of daily life.
It's the simple things. It is the teenager turning down their music at 10 p.m. so the elderly neighbor can sleep. It's the silent, collective agreement to pick up a piece of trash on the sidewalk instead of waiting for the city to do it.
Right. Confucius would look at that South African suburb and call it the ultimate triumph of Li. Li is often translated as ritual, but it really means the sacred, everyday etiquette of mutual consideration that holds a society together.
And the prophets would look at that exact same behavior and call it the fruit of Taqwa, a profound internal God consciousness that naturally overflows into beautiful, upright character. In that quiet neighborhood, the method of Confucius and the message of the prophets are operating seamlessly together.
It's just brilliant.
And De Bruijn elevates this synthesis into a grand cosmic vision. He introduces the concept of the decree of heaven. Confucius referred to it as Tianming, the immutable moral natural order of the universe. The Quran refers to it as Sunnat Allah, the unchanging pattern of God's interaction with creation.
And for most of history, geography got in the way of that pattern being recognized universally.
Exactly. For nearly all of human history, as we saw with the Sufis and the Chinese, massive oceans, mountain ranges, and language barriers created impenetrable silos of ignorance. The different branches of humanity couldn't learn from each other.
But the relentless machinery of globalization completely shattered those silos.
Precisely. Because communication is now instant and ideas flow like water across borders, humanity is being forced to confront a reality we have historically violently resisted. Virtue is universal. It is not tribal.
Governments hate that idea.
Well, they fight it constantly. Modern governments can attempt to erect massive border walls, implement severe tariffs, and strictly control the flow of human bodies. The state attempts to exert its power over physical space. But the decree of heaven, the Sunnat Allah, operates on a completely different axis.
It operates on time.
Yes, it worked through time. It worked through the long, slow arc of history. And when space and time collide, history always, ultimately, wins.
I want you to really think about that for a second. You, listening to this deep dive right now, picture your own street. Visualize your own neighbors. In the grand, terrifying scope of history, the massive conquering armies are entirely silent.
They're just footnotes now.
Exactly. The sprawling, intricate bureaucracies of the Abbasids and the Zhou dynasties have crumbled into dust. But what actually survived the grinding wheel of time, the private, unremarkable daily discipline of ordinary people choosing to respect the person living next to them.
That's the real legacy.
The prophets endured the wilderness to deliver the foundation, the message. Confucius spent a lifetime charting the social blueprint, the method. And today, everyday people, simply by choosing not to be petty, are the living proof of these ancient prophecies coming to fruition.
It is a staggering realization. De Bruijn successfully demonstrates that across millennia, across completely alienated continents, and across wildly different theological foundations, the absolute zenith of human virtue really comes down to something very simple.
The final answer to that initial German question of the Mensch.
Exactly. It ultimately boils down to the microethics of how you treat the person whose driveway is next to yours.
It takes this massive, intimidating, cosmic philosophical puzzle and lands it squarely on your own front porch. It is such a brilliant lens to look through.
And, this raises a highly provocative question, one that forces us to reevaluate our assumptions about the future.
Oh, I like where this is going.
If the decree of heaven and the unstoppable momentum of globalization are naturally dissolving tribal borders and forcing this ultimate moral synthesis to occur quietly at the neighborhood level, we really have to ask ourselves something radical. Are traditional nation-states and massive centralized religious institutions actually becoming obsolete when it comes to the business of teaching morality?
That is a fascinating thought.
Right. If history proves that empires always rot from the inside out because they cannot cure the Khabeeth heart, maybe we are looking in the wrong direction for salvation. As we look to the future, perhaps the ultimate guardians of human virtue aren't kings, politicians, or high clerics.
The institutions are too big to fix the microethics.
Exactly. Maybe the true guardians are simply the ordinary people living on your street.
That completely upends the traditional hierarchy of where we expect moral leadership to come from. It places the ultimate responsibility right back in our own hands. I want to thank you all for joining us on this incredibly expansive deep dive today. So, the next time you step outside to grab the mail, take a look around your neighborhood.
You might see things a little differently.
You really might. You might just be watching the grand arc of history unfolding right there on your block, proving what it really means to be amends. Take care, everyone.